Hello! Chapter 6, Snow Feathers, 1959. This is the chapter where Ruby's sister Gillian dies. Throughout the chapter, Ruby frequently mentions her death, and after it happens, it's unusually light-hearted. Gillian dies at the pantomime. Characterization. Ruby attempts to shift the blame for Gillian's death, saying, so really she's responsible for Gillian's death, about Bunty. She's subconsciously guilty about Pearl even though she does nothing wrong. It's also because of this experience that she feels she must blame someone for everything that goes wrong, even if it's an accident. Ruby also shows her resentment towards Gillian, saying, you see, I'm supposed to be doing something, but our Gillian isn't. This is barely contained rage for framing her from Pearl's death that Gillian does, even though she doesn't actually know that it's happened consciously. Ruby has a light attitude towards death, and she knows it. She says, I think Patricia and I should share Gillian's presence, but I don't say so because I know it isn't the right attitude. She's psychologically damaged from Pearl's death. He walked into the kitchen and found Bunty doing her impression of the martyred wife. She should take it up professionally. Bunty once again displays her characteristics of sullenness and unpleasantness, echoing Ada in her false saintly look. Ruby says, I think life would be tidier for her if we didn't sleep in our beds at all, echoing Bunty's resentment of having children. Ruby said, sometimes I try to imagine Bunty as a child, but for some reason this makes me unbearably sad, as all the childish joy is lost from Bunty now. Ruby is foreshadowing the chapter about the Sunday school outing. Patricia isn't really in the same space-time continuum as the rest of us anymore. Patricia is a teenager now, showing the sullenness of one, a sullenness which she always possessed, but which is amplified with her age. Ruby says, if this is what being an adolescent is like, then I do not want to be one, foreshadowing her own sullenness as a teenager, which almost results in her death from suicide. It must have been doubly difficult for her to undertake this role, for although she is 13 and arguably the most grown-up member of the family, it is Patricia who more than anyone mourns the way magic has drained from our world. She is, despite her sullenness, the figure of maturity in the family, and she also wishes the world still seemed magical, but she's probably the only one who doesn't still think it is because of her maturity. Patricia cares terribly about everything, despite shrugging her shoulders in that way, which she has of suggesting she couldn't care less about anything. Since Gillian's death is in this chapter, Atkinson characterizes the shit out of her before killing her. Ruby says that Gillian and I rarely discuss anything. She shouts, I ignore her, when she's talking about her parents arguing. It's clear that Ruby has no respect for Gillian, giving George a big toothy grin. Hello, Daddy, she beams at him. If only she would teach me how to do that before she goes. Ruby's clearly feeling jealous of Gillian's love that she gets from her parents, although ironically the reason her parents don't love her as much as Gillian is because they think she killed Pearl, whereas actually Gillian did. The techniques problem, Donald Trump style. It's Christmas Eve when Gillian pays the price of all those golden blonde curls. Ruby spends the first half of the chapter building tension to Gillian's death, as if it is preordained and everybody realizes she must die, although even Ruby doesn't realize in the actual story, probably. This is very postmodern and shows that Ruby still has her omniscience, which she seemed to have lost in chapter 4. This also foreshadows Pearl's death, as it happened very near Christmas, and we often see characters die at this time. Ruby says, This is a special occasion after all, the pantomime, Christmas, not to mention Gillian's death. I'm going to leave that mistake in because it's fucking postmodernism. This is the one instance that Atkinson uses script in the book in an argument between George and Bunty. This possibly connects to the pantomime later in the chapter, and it does create humour. It's all about George and Bunty talking about the floozy, George's new mistress, or it could just be Doreen. Ever since coming back from my mysterious exile in Dewsbury, I have been a scapegoat in this house. Ruby does not realise that the family resents her for Pearl's death, something that continues until she finally discovers the truth in chapter 11. When Bunty loses Gillian, she says, My Gillian! My Pearl! The lack of capitalization showing that Ruby is unaware that Pearl ever existed. She said, Surely it's me that's the jewel of the family. Ruby once again shows Bunty's love of film, saying she is being very brave, rather like Deborah Kerr in The King and I. Ruby uses bathos frequently after Gillian dies, such as saying Patricia has no reverence for Gillian's newly dead condition. However, Ruby does point out that, although we believe she was dead last night, it's almost impossible to believe that she's still dead this morning. Gillian is petrified that I'm going to do something nasty to her when she's fast asleep and unable to defend herself. Ha! If only. Here, Gillian seems to forget that she was the one who killed Pearl, seeing Ruby in the same light as the rest of the family. In the fight between George and Bunty, Ruby uses frequent metaphors to describe their behaviour. Even though this is not really happening, they are described in so much detail that they take on a magical realist quality. But no, nothing as simple as that for Our Lady of the Kitchen, who is pretending to dish out pork chops, mashed potatoes, and carrots, but is really shooting steel tension wires from her fingertips, until the whole house is crisscrossed with the metal web of Bunty's thoughts. Ruby uses historical references to describe her own life events, saying that Gillian's death is the primary cause of the great and truly terrible Pet Shop fire. This is a reference to the Great Fire of London. She pushes her hair back from her forehead in the centuries-old genetic gesture of suffering. Bunty is using the same gesture as Alice did in the first footnote, in order to show her own suffering. Themes. While the chapter mainly concerns Gillian's death, there's still time for a bit of the old favourite, unhappy marriage. For example, Ruby says, George is trying to imitate the way he thinks happily married couples speak to each other, bemoaning the sad fact that neither of them, George or Bunty, has ever experienced happy marriage. George stubs out his cigarette and makes a kind of snorting noise in his throat and settles back in his chair to watch Bunty making his cup of tea. Well, this is 1959. As the book has many times represented, women are unequal in the 1950s, but here Bunty is clearly seen no more than a sexual object by George. He does not want to help her. He sees her as a tool for his housework. Last words to people are important here. Bunty's last words to Gillian are, "Why don't you just bloody grow up, Gillian?" Whereas Ruby's are, "Do you want the last red one, or can I have it?" Talking about sweets. Ruby says she does not have to feel guilty about this, because she didn't say anything cruel to Gillian. As ever, she takes a light attitude towards Gillian's death, which is slightly troubling for the reader. This book is obsessed with death, as we already know, and Gillian's death is, other than Pearl's, the most important death for the characters of the book, particularly Bunty, who is sent over the edge by grief for losing a child a second time. "She's behind you! She's behind you!" Gillian yells with abandon. She means the Wicked Witch, but I fear that it's Sweet Death in all her gauzy splendour. Ruby says that her and her family enjoy our Christmas dinner more than seems appropriate after the demise of a close relative. An irony that despite the death of Gillian, Ruby and Patricia enjoy themselves the more because George and Bunty are not around. Like Ruby, the wife of Bath has a casual, inappropriate attitude to the deaths of her loved ones. When at the funeral of her fourth husband, she looks at Jenkin, her fifth, thinking, "He had a pair of legs and a feet so clean and fair," as in these times legs were considered the most sexual part of a human being. In many ways, the death of Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe, is similar to Gillian's death, because in both cases it's the death of an unloved member of the family who the main character, protagonist, dislikes, and there's only a limited amount of grief because of this. I know that I must say goodbye.